Early morning sunlight filtered through the thick canopy of oak trees lining the tranquil neighborhood street, casting dappled shadows along the pavement. A lone patrol car idled near the curb, its engine humming softly. The officer inside was finishing a routine paperwork check, tapping an official form against the steering wheel with one hand while sipping tepid coffee with the other. The radio crackled with mundane updates: loose dog on Walnut Street, suspicious vehicle on 3rd Avenue. Nothing out of the ordinary in this small suburban district. The sky overhead was clear, the day looked promisingly quiet, and Officer Marcus Riley hoped his shift would remain that way. He took another sip of his coffee. Just as he was about to settle into the comfortable hum of a slow day, something darted across the street. He only caught a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision, some small, trembling creature. Setting his coffee down, Marcus craned his neck to look through the windshield. A tiny figure emerged from behind a parked sedan. It was a kitten, thin, ragged, with fur that looked once pristine but was now matted with dirt. Strange though, the kitten appeared to be in distress, mewling so pitifully it could break the hardest heart. Marcus leaned forward, unable to look away. A sense of unease curled in the pit of his stomach when he realized the kitten's meows almost sounded like crying. He reached for the door handle, pushing the cruiser's door open carefully. The kitten staggered into the middle of the street, glancing around as though searching for something or someone. Then it spotted Marcus, its gaze locked onto him. Without hesitation, it stumbled forward, paws tapping against the asphalt in a desperate scramble. Marcus stood there, uncertain whether the kitten would be afraid and dart off, but it didn't run. Instead, it moved toward him as if it recognized him, like it had been looking for him specifically. Marcus crouched down, speaking in a soothing voice, "Hey there, little one, it's okay." The kitten's big, frightened eyes were brimming with some kind of panic Marcus had never seen in an animal before. When it reached him, the kitten brushed against his pant leg, pressing its small body against him as though it needed comfort. He noticed it had a collar, a delicate-looking leather band. Strange for a stray, he thought, it must have a home somewhere. He gingerly lifted the kitten, surprised by how weightless it felt in his hands. It was shivering, letting out heart-wrenching yowls that echoed through the quiet street. For a split second, Marcus felt a twinge of guilt. He'd been so prepared for a slow day, so comfortable in the mundane. Now, confronted with this pitiful creature, he sensed that something was off. He looked at the collar. At first, he didn't notice anything special other than a small, tarnished metal nameplate. But as he cleared away some caked-on dirt with his thumb, he noticed an engraved emblem. It was a triangular symbol with odd swirling lines carved around the edges. The lines formed a pattern resembling intertwining vines, or perhaps stylized snakes. It wasn't any sort of ordinary brand name or typical ID tag. Marcus felt his heart rate spike. He didn't know exactly what that symbol meant, but a chill prickled at his neck. Something about it tugged at a half-remembered recollection. His mind raced back to his earliest days in the academy when they'd been briefed on certain cult symbols or specialized markings used by criminals. But he couldn't place this exact emblem. Still, a sense of dread seeped into him. Why would a kitten be wearing a collar with such a bizarre insignia? He looked around, expecting to see someone popping out from behind a house or gate, calling for their lost pet. Nobody was there. The street was silent aside from the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The kitten let out another plaintive wail, burying its face into the crook of Marcus's arm. That was when he noticed the kitten's fur was damp in places, like it had been in water recently, or perhaps blood. Anxiously, he inspected the fur more closely. Dark smears matted the kitten's fur, too red to be mud. Marcus swallowed hard, his pulse thundering. Cautiously, he removed a clean handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at the kitten's neck, checking for injuries. The kitten flinched but didn't lash out, just let out a faint whimper. The smear came off on the handkerchief in a rusty maroon shade, blood for sure, but the kitten didn't appear to have any open wounds. It must be someone else's blood, Marcus realized with a jolt. The possibilities skittered through his mind. Maybe it was from another animal or a random accident. But the odd symbol on the collar and the kitten's terrified demeanor told him this was no simple matter. He felt his stomach twist with a sense of urgency. He gently placed the kitten in the passenger seat of his cruiser, grabbed a small blanket from the trunk and wrapped it around the animal for warmth. The kitten watched him with wide, frightened eyes, mewing softly. Marcus got back in the driver's seat and radioed in. "This is Officer Riley," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've got a situation with an injured kitten that might be evidence in something bigger, requesting backup or instructions." He wasn't sure what he was requesting exactly. The dispatcher sounded confused but responded with typical procedure. "Officer Riley, is there a crime scene? Over." Marcus glanced at the kitten again. "I'm not sure, but it's likely we're dealing with more than just a lost pet. I'll report to the station." He started the engine, carefully driving away from the serene street. The kitten, curled in the blanket, kept making that low, pitiful sound. It was unsettling, like the poor thing was carrying a warning or a message, and only Marcus could decipher it. In the station parking lot, Marcus gingerly scooped the kitten into his arms and headed inside. The precinct bustled with the usual chaos, phones ringing, people talking, the hum of computers. No one paid much attention to him carrying a small bundle until he stepped up to the front desk. One of the younger officers, Hayes, spotted him and raised an eyebrow. "Seriously, Marcus, you on kitten rescue duty now?" he teased. But then he noticed the tension in Marcus's face. Something up. Marcus nodded grimly, beckoning Hayes closer. He unwrapped the blanket just enough to show the bizarre collar. Hayes leaned in. His good-natured smirk melted almost instantly. The swirling emblem caught his eye like it had Marcus. Hayes opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. He looked spooked. Without a word, Hayes led Marcus into a small briefing room off the main corridor. Inside, they set the kitten on the table. It was still trembling. Marcus explained everything that had happened, the blood in the fur, the kitten's odd behavior, the fact it seemed to be seeking out help specifically from a police officer. Hayes exhaled slowly, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. "So you're saying the kitten ran right to you?" Marcus nodded. "It was like it was waiting for me, and I can't place that symbol on the collar, but it feels ominous. I'm not sure if it's some kind of ritual symbol or gang sign or something else entirely." Hayes pursed his lips. "Let's call in Oliver from Records. He's got a knack for obscure symbols." They summoned Oliver, a civilian archivist who specialized in scanning old police files. Oliver was a wiry man with a quick intellect and an encyclopedic memory for obscure cases. He arrived with a laptop under his arm. Marcus gently took the collar off the kitten and handed it to Oliver for closer inspection. The cat let out a sad little mew in protest, as if frightened to lose its only possession. Oliver examined the collar under a desk lamp, tracing the engraved lines with a fingertip. "I've seen something like this before, maybe in one of the older case files from the 1980s or so. There was a string of incidents involving missing pets that turned up with strange markings. Let me do a quick search." He tapped furiously on his laptop, pulling up an extensive digital archive. Minutes ticked by, the tension in the room mounting as the kitten stared at them with those sorrowful eyes. Eventually, Oliver's eyes lit up. "Found something, a cold case from 1987. There's a mention of a symbol described as a triangular emblem with coiled shapes. The investigating officer, Sergeant Ellis, believed it to be connected to an underground group rumored to practice rituals. The details are vague, but apparently there were sightings of a hooded figure who left these symbols around crime scenes." The case was never solved and the group's name was never confirmed. Some speculation it was more myth than reality, but the symbol was real enough that it ended up in the file. Hayes let out a low whistle. "You think that group is still around?" Marcus rubbed his chin. "If it is, then why a kitten, and why run to me? I've never heard of any animal spontaneously seeking police the way this little guy did. It's almost like it was desperate to pass on a message." Oliver shrugged, still examining the collar's details. "Could be that the kitten escaped from somewhere, some place it shouldn't have been, or someone put the kitten out on the street in hopes it'd be found. Maybe they wanted to raise an alarm without exposing themselves." Marcus and Hayes exchanged a glance. The atmosphere in the small room felt heavy, thick with possibilities that none of them liked. Marcus looked down at the kitten again, noticing how thin it was. The blanket had slipped, revealing the kitten's torso. More dried blood clung to its hind legs. He took a deep breath. "We might need a vet to check for any injuries or, I don't know, hidden devices." The notion seemed wild, but given the circumstances, he wasn't ruling anything out. As bizarre as it sounded, placing a small tracking device on a kitten to spy on the police wasn't beyond the realm of imagination if some criminal or cult wanted inside information. Oliver nodded. "I'll keep digging in the meantime, see if there's any reference to modern sightings of that symbol. Hayes, you should check any local missing pet reports or maybe break-ins at pet stores or animal shelters. This might connect in ways we can't predict." Marcus gently picked the kitten back up. He could feel its racing heartbeat against his palm. "I'll head to Dr. Patton's clinic. She's the on-call vet we usually work with. Let's hope she can do a thorough examination." The drive to the veterinary clinic was slow and tense. Marcus tried to soothe the kitten, but it seemed to grow more agitated the closer they got, as if it knew something else was about to happen. Dr. Patton was a calm, middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair. She ushered Marcus into an exam room right away, her expression concerned when she saw the little creature. Marcus explained in vague terms that the kitten might have been involved in something criminal. He asked her to look for injuries or anything unusual. Dr. Patton nodded, her gaze serious. She carefully cleaned the fur and inspected the kitten from head to tail. The exam went smoothly at first, revealing only minor scrapes, but halfway through Dr. Patton froze, leaning over the kitten's rib cage. "There's something here under the skin. I can feel a small bump." Marcus's stomach dropped. He leaned in. The vet gently parted the fur and pressed lightly on an area behind the kitten's right front leg. Indeed, there was a small raised portion beneath the skin, undetectable except by an expert hand. Marcus swallowed. Is it a microchip? Could be, Dr. Patton said, but it's not in the usual spot. Pet microchips are typically placed between the shoulder blades. This is off to the side. She prepared a small syringe with a local anesthetic and carefully inserted it around the bump. Once the area was numbed, she used a tiny scalpel to make an incision. The kitten shuddered but didn't cry out. Marcus felt the knot of tension in his gut tighten. After a delicate moment, Dr. Patton used forceps to extract a tiny metallic capsule. Marcus's eyes went wide. It wasn't a standard pet microchip. Instead, it resembled a short cylindrical device about the size of a large grain of rice but with odd ridges along its length. Dr. Patton placed it in a sterile dish and let out a soft gasp. I've never seen anything like this. It's definitely not your typical ID chip. Marcus felt cold dread creep through him. This was bigger than he'd imagined. Can you tell if it's some kind of tracker? Dr. Patton shook her head. Not with the tools I have here. I can do an X-ray of it, but I'd suggest you bring it to a forensic lab. This is beyond me. Marcus nodded, gingerly picking up the dish. Thank you, Dr. Patton, and please keep this quiet. If someone knows we have this device, it could be dangerous for both you and the kitten. She nodded solemnly. I understand. Please keep me posted. I'll watch the kitten overnight if you'd like. Make sure it's recovering. Marcus glanced at the kitten. It had its eyes closed and was breathing softly, clearly exhausted. Yeah, he said, hesitating. He realized he already felt protective of the little creature. If you can look after it, that would be a relief. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Dr. Patton gently stroked the kitten's head. We'll take good care of her here. Marcus left with the strange metallic capsule securely sealed in a biohazard bag stowed in his jacket pocket. Once he was back in his cruiser, he glanced around, half expecting to see suspicious figures lurking. The quiet suburb outside the clinic looked normal enough, an older man walking a dog, a woman pushing a stroller, no ominous shapes, yet the sense of being watched crept over him, making his skin prickle. He drove back to the station, scanning his mirrors for any trailing cars. Nothing. Nevertheless, by the time he stepped through the station doors, his nerves were frayed. He went straight to the records area where Oliver was still hunched over his laptop. Hey, Oliver said, glancing up. Any luck? Marcus placed the biohazard bag on the desk. Found this inside the kitten. Oliver's eyes widened. He opened the bag carefully, studying the device. I'll see if the lab guys can run an analysis. He paused, lowering his voice. Look, I've been digging into older files. There's mention of a splinter group from about 30 years ago. They called themselves various names. One was rumored to be the Circulus Serpentis. They used triangular imagery with serpentine lines. They were associated with animal sacrifice, bizarre rituals, rumored kidnappings, but it was never proven. The last mention was early 1990s, but it was all hush-hush. The department never made it public, mostly because there was no conclusive evidence. The files mentioned suspicious gatherings on the outskirts of town. Marcus felt his blood run cold. Could that group still be active? Had they re-emerged, or had they never really gone away? So maybe the kitten's collar symbol is from this Circulus Serpentis, or at least something similar. Oliver nodded. Seems likely. This device might be some new age tech they're using. If they're involved in heavy criminal activity, that would explain how it ended up in a kitten. Maybe it escaped or someone set it free intentionally. A wave of conflicting feelings crashed over Marcus. On one hand, he was determined to investigate. On the other, he was apprehensive about stumbling into the crosshairs of some clandestine organization. We need to be careful, he finally said. Let's keep this quiet until we know more. I'll get in touch with the forensics lab. We should keep a tight lid on who knows about this device. Oliver agreed. I'll keep reading. You let me know what the lab says. Marcus spent the next hours filling out preliminary reports with carefully chosen language. He didn't want to tip off anyone who might have connections. Then he hand-delivered the capsule to the forensics technicians, who promised to expedite an analysis. The tension hung in the air, a sense that they were stepping into a hidden labyrinth of secrets. That evening, as the sky turned a murky twilight, Marcus found himself alone in his apartment with his thoughts swirling. He replayed every moment of the day, the kitten's desperate run, the eerie collar, the discovery of that metal device under its skin. He picked at his dinner without tasting it, wondering whether he should call Dr. Patton to check on the kitten. She had his number. If anything changed, she'd contact him. Still, his stomach twisted with worry. On a whim, Marcus grabbed his old textbooks from the police academy. He rummaged through the sections on occult symbology. Most were typical references to pentagrams, runic scripts, and so forth. Nothing that precisely matched the swirling triangular emblem. The name Circulus Serpentis wasn't anywhere, but the mention in the old case files had been enough to rattle him. Could an entire cult be operating in the shadows of this quiet suburban area for decades without detection? The next morning, an urgent call from forensics woke him. He scrambled to answer, heart thudding. The lab technician, sounding breathless, said, "You need to get down here right away. We opened that device you gave us." Marcus felt a jolt of dread, and it's not just a tracker, there's a small memory chip inside, a data storage unit heavily encrypted. We couldn't break through the encryption, but there are definitely large amounts of data. We're going to keep trying, but there's something else. A tiny reservoir of some unknown chemical was also inside. We're not sure yet, but it could be a toxin or something else entirely. Marcus's mind reeled. You're saying the capsule contained data and possibly a chemical payload? Yes, the tech replied. That means it might have a dual purpose. If someone tried to tamper with it and failed, it could release that chemical. We got lucky. We use specialized tools. I'm not sure what that means in the grand scheme, but it doesn't look good. He hung up, heart hammering in his chest. This was far more complicated than a random cult symbol. Someone had used a living creature, a vulnerable kitten, as a mule to carry this bizarre device. And if that group really was the Circulus Serpentis, it meant they had advanced capabilities. Marcus tried to calm his racing thoughts. He had to move methodically. He got dressed, hurried to the station, and found Oliver. The archivist looked drained, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Marcus," Oliver started, voice grim. "I found references to old county property records. There's a deserted lodge about 10 miles out of town by Pine Lake. Back in the 1970s and 80s, it was rumored to be used by an organization that matched the description of Circulus Serpentis. Locals mentioned strange gatherings, chanting at odd hours, but the lodge changed owners multiple times, each time under shell companies." Marcus took in the information, adrenaline spiking. "So we've got a possible location, we need to check it out." Hayes walked over, overhearing. "I'll join you, this is too big to handle alone." Marcus nodded. "We have to be careful, we don't know who in town could be connected to them. If they've stayed hidden this long, they might have allies in unexpected places." Oliver sighed. "Count me in, though I'm not a field guy. But if you need me to identify more symbols or find references on site, I'm your best bet." Marcus paused. He didn't want to put Oliver in danger, but the archivist made a valid point. "All right," he agreed carefully. "But let's keep it small, just the three of us. We go quietly, no official police cars, no big show of force. Let's see if the place is truly abandoned or if there's something going on." That evening, after they'd set up a reason to be out on a different detail, the three men borrowed an unmarked sedan from the motor pool and drove out past the edges of town. The road twisted through thickening forest, the sky dimming overhead as they ventured deeper into pine groves. Eventually they reached a cracked asphalt lane that ended in a rusty iron gate. Beyond it, through gnarled branches, they could see the silhouettes of a large, old lodge. The structure's windows were dark, the exterior battered by years of neglect. They parked the sedan a short distance away and approached on foot. The air was eerily still. A sense of being watched or of stepping onto forbidden ground pressed down on Marcus's chest. He glanced at Hayes and Oliver, both looked tense, scanning the surroundings, no sign of movement. The gate was chained shut, but it seemed no one had been here in years. Or so it appeared until they got closer. Marcus crouched and examined the ground near the gate. The dirt bore fresh tire tracks, something heavy had rolled through recently, flattening the grass. He signaled for the others to notice. Oliver's eyes flicked nervously to the lodge. They slipped around the gate, picking their way through overgrown bushes. As they neared the lodge's entrance, Marcus's flashlight illuminated graffiti scrawled across the weathered door, rude tags from local kids mostly, but near the bottom corner, faded and scratched, was a triangular symbol with swirling lines. It looked exactly like the one on the kitten's collar. Marcus felt a jolt of validation and fear. This place had been marked by that group. They tried the door, it was locked tight, metal rods reinforcing it. Walking around the perimeter, they found a side window that had been replaced with new glass, strange for an abandoned structure. With some effort, Hayes used a small pry bar and carefully opened it. They slipped into a musty corridor, the floor creaking underfoot. Dust particles danced in the flashlight beams, but Marcus smelled something faintly chemical in the air, like disinfectant or formaldehyde. Oliver pressed against the wall, whispering, "This place is bigger than I thought. We should stick together." Step by step, they moved through hallways littered with old furniture, peeling wallpaper, and debris. But as they ventured deeper, they found doors that weren't old at all. Some were sturdy metal, installed relatively recently. A sense of dread mounted with every footstep. At the end of one corridor, they stumbled upon a room that was locked from the outside with a heavy bolt. Marcus carefully slid it open. The door creaked, revealing a space that looked like some kind of laboratory or medical room. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with vials and containers. A battered table in the middle had restraints built into it. Marcus's heart pounded. This was no innocent squatter's den, it was a place of calculated operations, possibly experiments. Oliver's face turned pale as he glanced at the labels on some vials. They were coded Compound A3, Serum B7, cryptic references that meant nothing to them. Hayes opened a small closet only to recoil. Inside were empty cages, several large, a few smaller. Each had old, dried bloodstains in the corners. Marcus felt a wave of nausea. The kitten's presence in all this now seemed horrifyingly clear, animal testing or worse. They heard a faint noise in the corridor, footsteps. The three froze, hearts hammering. They quickly flicked off their flashlights. Darkness swallowed them. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped right outside the door. Marcus heard a metallic clink, then silence. Instinctively, he gestured for them to hide. Oliver ducked behind a shelf. Hayes slid next to a large metal cabinet, and Marcus pressed himself against the wall by the door. His pulse pounded in his ears. Whoever was out there must have noticed something was amiss. The door began to open slowly, a crack of light from the corridor illuminating a sliver of the room. Marcus held his breath, bracing himself. A tall figure stepped inside, wearing dark clothing. Marcus couldn't make out the face in the gloom, just a silhouette. The figure reached for a light switch. An overhead bulb flickered on, bathing the room in harsh light. Marcus saw the intruder's face, hard-set, with suspicious eyes scanning the shelves. The man's gaze settled on the open closet with the empty cages. He muttered something under his breath, stepping further into the room. As he passed by Hayes's hiding spot, Hayes lunged, grabbing the man in a chokehold before he could shout. The man struggled, gasping, flailing for a weapon. Marcus dashed forward, pinning the intruder's arms. In seconds they had him on the floor, subdued. Oliver stood over them, panting, eyes wide. "Is there anyone else?" he whispered frantically. Marcus quickly reached down, patting the man's pockets. He found a phone, a key ring, and something small and metallic that looked suspiciously like the capsule removed from the kitten, only bigger. The man's eyes flashed with anger. He tried to speak, but Hayes tightened his grip. Marcus leaned in. "You're going to tell us what's going on here." The man bared his teeth but remained silent. Hayes glanced at the corridor. "We can't stay here, we need to go." Marcus nodded. "We'll take him in. Oliver, help me with his legs." As they worked to restrain the man, they heard more footsteps outside. Hayes and Oliver exchanged a panicked look. There was no time to slip away quietly now. Someone else was coming. They'd be trapped in this makeshift lab with no easy exit except the window they'd pried open. Marcus's mind raced. They had to decide whether to stand their ground or flee. If they fled, they risked losing any chance to learn more. If they stayed, they could be vastly outnumbered. In the swirl of that moment, the man under them began to chuckle, a low, sinister sound that sent a chill through Marcus. "You have no idea what you're stepping into," he hissed. "The circle never dies." Marcus felt fear coil in his gut. The footsteps grew louder, closer. This was only the beginning, and they all knew it. A surge of adrenaline coursed through Marcus as he pressed himself against the wall, listening to the approaching footsteps in the hallway. They grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by low voices just beyond the door. He, Hayes, and Oliver had subdued the tall man from the Circulus Serpentis, if indeed he belonged to that secret group, and now they were cornered inside a makeshift lab packed with chilling evidence of cruel experiments. The overhead light they had unintentionally switched on felt glaringly bright, as if a spotlight were shining down on them. Marcus exchanged a glance with Hayes, who still had the intruder pinned. Oliver hovered behind a metal cabinet, eyes filled with apprehension. The footsteps suddenly halted just outside. For a moment, the only sound was the lab's buzzing fluorescent light. Then the door jerked outward, someone clearly testing if it was locked. Hard in his throat, Marcus silently gestured to Hayes and Oliver. They needed to take cover behind the lab counters or risk being seen if the door opened fully. Hayes, jaw tight, tried to maintain his grip on the subdued man. But the intruder let out a sharp whistle, a short, high-pitched signal that echoed within the small room. Before Hayes could clamp a hand over his mouth, the man twisted violently. Marcus lunged to help, but the intruder's wiry strength was surprising. He fought like someone with combat training. His elbow flew back, catching Marcus square in the ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Hayes wrestled him, but in seconds, the man slammed his head backward into Hayes's nose. With a grunt of pain, Hayes reflexively loosened his hold. Now free, the intruder rolled across the floor and scrambled to his feet. The door burst open. Two more figures rushed in, a man and a woman, both dressed in dark clothing, each brandishing handguns. The woman spotted Marcus and pivoted, eyes blazing. Before she could fire, Oliver let out a trembling shout, pitching a metal tray at her from behind a shelf. It clattered against her shoulder, throwing off her aim. Her gun went off, the shot ricocheting into the ceiling. Sparks and plaster rained down. In the confusion, Marcus dove for cover behind a broad steel table, heart pounding. Hayes, blood trickling from his nose, managed to knock the intruder's legs out from under him before the man could retrieve the odd capsule he'd dropped earlier. The second new arrival, an older man with steel-gray hair, leveled his weapon at Hayes. Hayes froze. Marcus, catching sight of the muzzle aimed at his partner, burst from behind the table. "Police!" he shouted, even though it was obvious these people knew exactly who they were. He aimed his own sidearm, but the woman was quicker. Her second shot whizzed by his shoulder, forcing him to duck again. Oliver scrambled out of range, but not before the steel-gray man swung the butt of his handgun at him. Oliver staggered back with a cry, holding his forearm in pain. Marcus spotted an opening and squeezed off 2 rounds into the wall above them, intentionally missing just to disrupt their focus. For a split second, the man hesitated. Hayes took advantage of that moment, launching a savage punch to the older man's ribcage. The man doubled over, letting out a strangled gasp. In a flash, Hayes gripped the intruder's gun hand and twisted it aside. The shot fired harmlessly into a shelf of vials that shattered in a cascade of glass and chemical fluid. A pungent odor rose in the room, stinging Marcus's eyes. The tall intruder, who had originally been pinned, attempted to scramble away, presumably to call for reinforcements or sound an alarm. Marcus raced after him, adrenaline pounding in every limb. But before he could catch him, the woman stepped between them, raising her weapon again. Her eyes were wild, and she was breathing hard. In the sudden hush, Marcus became acutely aware of his own ragged breathing. "Drop it," the woman hissed, gesturing with her gun. "All of you drop your weapons." Marcus's hand trembled on his sidearm. He recognized that she was cornered and had the advantage of aim at the moment. The older man was struggling on his knees, winded, and the tall intruder, despite being battered, was edging toward the hallway. Hayes and Oliver were partially exposed near the shattered shelves, uncertain whether to comply or gamble on another breakout. Fear coiled in Marcus's gut. If these people were truly part of Circulus Serpentis, some clandestine, brutal group, they might shoot them all the second they lowered their guns. Yet the woman's face showed a flicker of desperation, not purely aggression. She was outnumbered, pinned by the presence of multiple adversaries. Marcus realized she might also be searching for a way out without more gunfire, especially after the loud shots that had already rung out. Any more noise might draw unwanted attention or alert others in the building to a full-blown melee. Marcus tried to keep his voice steady, though his heart hammered. "We have no intention of hurting you if we can avoid it, but we're not lowering our weapons until you and your friends stand down." A faint smirk touched her lips, though her eyes blazed with tension. "Your presence here is an error, a grave one. You can't possibly understand what you're interfering with." Hayes, panting, wiped blood from his nose. "We understand enough. People are getting hurt, animals are being mutilated or tested on." She cut him off, voice vibrating with anger. "You know nothing. You see a fraction of what's happening and think you found some monstrous secret, but knowledge requires sacrifice. All progress does." Marcus felt his stomach twist. He had come across extremist individuals before, but the fervor in this woman's gaze unnerved him. "This so-called progress is illegal," he said quietly, "and it ends tonight." The woman's expression hardened. She seemed about to respond when from somewhere deeper in the corridor, a siren-like alarm began to wail, echoing through the lodge's halls. Strobing red lights from emergency beacons, previously hidden behind broken wall panels, kicked on, flooding the corridor and parts of the lab with a pulsing crimson glow. The tall intruder by the door quickly took advantage of the distraction and bolted, leaving the woman and the older man behind. She spat a curse, then with a cold glare at Marcus, she shouted, "Fall back." The older man, still grimacing in pain, nodded. On some unspoken cue, they both pivoted and fled into the hall. Marcus and Hayes didn't hesitate. They sprinted after them, guns at the ready. Oliver trailed behind, gripping a piece of broken shelf wood like a makeshift club. The hallway was bathed in that harsh, intermittent red light, sirens shrieking loud enough to make Marcus's temples throb. They glimpsed the intruders turning a corner at the far end. They followed, boots echoing on the dusty floor, passing doors that stood ajar. Marcus caught fleeting glimpses of strange equipment in some rooms, shadowy outlines of computer terminals, glass containers with unidentifiable contents. The entire lodge, once presumably a rustic retreat, had been transformed into a clandestine facility. At the next corner, a jolt of gunfire erupted, 2 muzzle flashes lighting the corridor. Marcus and Hayes dove behind an overturned wooden cabinet. Bullets splintered the wood overhead. Oliver flattened himself against the opposite wall, terror etched across his face. "Go back," the woman's voice echoed along the hallway. "This place will be in lockdown soon and you'll never get out alive. Leave now and maybe you keep your lives." Hayes scowled, checking the bullet count in his pistol. "She's bluffing, trying to buy time." Marcus nodded, heart pounding. He carefully peeked around the cabinet, returning fire once in the direction of the muzzle flashes. He heard cursing, then the footsteps retreated further down. The wailing alarm showed no sign of stopping. If anything, it grew more urgent. "This is insane," Oliver muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "There might be more of them. We can't just chase them blindly." Marcus exhaled shakily. His every instinct told him that pressing forward without backup was risky, yet the thought of letting these people vanish, letting Circulus Serpentis vanish again, felt like abandoning the kitten and every other victim. He signaled to Hayes to proceed more cautiously. They pressed on, hugging the walls. The corridor ended at a large set of double doors, the overhead sign flickering in the strobe red basement stairwell access. The doors were locked tight, sealed by a metal bar. "She's definitely leading us on a chase," Oliver said, voice trembling with adrenaline. But the alarm suggests we might only have minutes before this place either floods with more cult members or triggers some fail-safe. Marcus's eyes swept the area. Another smaller corridor branched off to the right, presumably a wing they hadn't explored. In a last-ditch effort, he tried the door handle to the basement, but it wouldn't budge. The loud clang of the bar told him it was electronically sealed. Hayes leaned against the wall, wincing from his bleeding nose and bruises. If we keep chasing them, we'll lose track of the exit. We might get trapped. Marcus weighed his options. The primal survival part of him wanted to retreat, get reinforcements, and return with more officers and a warrant. But then the memory of that tiny kitten, blood on its fur, the bizarre device under its skin, spurred him forward. These were dangerous people operating in secrecy. Time was critical. We can't leave without more intel. The second we leave, they'll wipe this place clean. We need something solid to bring the entire operation down. Oliver glanced back the way they came. Let's see if we can find an office or a records room, something that can't be easily destroyed or moved. Marcus nodded, agreed. They retreated from the locked double doors and took the smaller corridor to the right. The wailing alarm followed them, accompanied by the pulsing red lights. The gloom in these hallways was oppressive, the air stale. Old tapestries and rustic lamps hinted at the lodge's original purpose, but they were overshadowed by the renovated sections, reinforced doors, hidden security cameras, and more of that cryptic cult graffiti. At last they found a door labeled with a simple brass plate, administrative. Beneath that, the swirling triangular emblem was etched into the wood, barely visible but definitely present. Marcus tested the knob, locked. Hayes found a key on the ring he'd taken from the first intruder, fumbling through several until he found a match. With a click, the door swung open. Inside was a cramped office space dominated by a metal desk, battered filing cabinets, and a row of monitors now dark. The entire room smelled faintly of must and old paper. A single overhead light flickered. Marcus quickly closed the door behind them, muffling the screech of the alarm. Oliver rushed to the monitors, searching for a power switch. If these are security feeds, we might see the rest of the building. Hayes crossed to the filing cabinets, pulling on the top drawer. Locked, he murmured. He rifled through the stolen key ring again, eventually finding one that fit. With a soft grind of metal, the drawer opened. Inside were manila folders stuffed with printed documents. Marcus hurried to help, rifling through them. The contents made little sense at first glance: chemical formulas, lists of codenames, and references to Stage 5 Harvest, Protocol Delta, and other cryptic phrases. But it was enough to confirm that the group was performing organized experiments. Some of the documents appeared to detail volunteers or test subjects with numbers assigned to them, though few real names appeared. There were references to feline subject 14, canine subject 2, and also a handful mentioning humans, subject 5H, with remarks about psychotropic thresholds. Marcus felt revulsion twist his stomach. It wasn't just animals. If these notes were real, Circulus Serpentis had been using human test subjects too. He flipped through more papers, snapping photos of everything with his phone. Even if they couldn't haul all the evidence out physically, digital copies might suffice to trigger a full investigation. Oliver finally managed to power up the monitors. One after another, they flickered to life, showing various angles of corridors and rooms. The images jumped between multiple cameras, about half displayed static as if the wiring or cameras were damaged. But a few were functional. One showed the lab they just fled, now empty except for spilled chemicals. Another showed what looked like an underground chamber with concrete walls and a series of cages along one side, each cage wrapped in thick chains. Look, Oliver said, pointing to one feed. The vantage point was from high in a corner, looking down on a wide, circular room. Around the perimeter were black-robed figures. The camera's resolution was poor, and the strobing red lights made everything hard to see. But the shapes were unmistakable, at least half a dozen people in those robes, some holding large candles. In the center lay a bizarre diagram etched on the floor, a triangle circled by serpentine lines. Hayes swallowed audibly. That's not some ephemeral rumor about weird rituals, that's the real thing happening right now. Marcus pressed closer. They must have convened either because of the alarm or because it's part of their routine. If we had any doubt this place was a cult stronghold, it's gone now. Oliver clicked through the feeds. On another camera, the tall intruder from earlier appeared, jogging down a corridor with the older man and the woman. They seemed to be heading toward that circular chamber, each wearing an expression of urgency. More people in black robes darted in and out of the camera frames, their faces hidden, as though mobilizing under the sudden threat of infiltration. Hayes ran a hand through his hair. We found a lot more than we bargained for. We can't take them all on. Marcus nodded grimly. We need to get out, but not without collecting as much proof as possible. First, let's see if there's anything in this office that can't be destroyed easily or could cripple them if they try to vanish. He and Hayes pulled open more drawers, scanning documents. Oliver rummaged in a side cabinet and found a battered laptop. Its cover bore the same swirling emblem. He tried to power it on, but it prompted for a password. Encrypted, Oliver muttered. I might be able to bypass it eventually, but it'll take time we don't have. Marcus took the laptop anyway, slipping it into a backpack they found beneath the desk. Every moment they lingered felt more dangerous. The alarm siren continued to bleat, though slightly muted by the door. Suddenly, Oliver stiffened, staring at the monitors. On the feed for the underground chamber, robed figures were moving toward a set of large metal doors. Through them, a cluster of shackled individuals was being ushered in, men and women, eyes vacant, some stumbling. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Those look like actual prisoners, Oliver whispered. One captive caught his attention. A teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16, with bruises on his arms, was being pulled forward by robed captors. Despite the camera's poor resolution, Marcus could see the kid's terrified expression. The group was herded into the center of that bizarre triangular symbol on the floor, ringed by robed cult members. Hayes stared, horror tightening his features. This is beyond experimentation. They're about to do some twisted ritual with actual people. Marcus's mind whirled. This was the tangible evidence they needed, but it also meant lives were in immediate danger. We have to do something, he said in a strained voice. We can't just walk away and leave them to be sacrificed or whatever it is they do down there. Oliver's face was pale, but we're only three. They're an entire cult, presumably armed. We at least have to try, Marcus insisted. We have to get those people out. If we flee, they'll disappear again or kill them before we can bring backup. Hayes let out a shaky sigh. Then we do it, but we need a plan. Marcus's gaze fell on the security console. Oliver, can you trigger doors or disable locks from here? Oliver shook his head, scanning the screen. Looks like the system is partially offline. The alarm might have severed some connections. I can open or close certain internal gates, but it's spotty. I can't guarantee I'll get them all, and I don't see a direct feed to the door that leads to that circular chamber. Maybe it's on a separate system. Marcus clenched his jaw. Then we do this the old-fashioned way. We find that chamber, we get the hostages out. They left the office, stepping back into the strobing red corridor. The documents and laptop in Marcus's backpack clattered softly as he moved. Ahead, the hallway veered left, leading to the central part of the lodge. The alarm blared, echoing from every corridor. As they advanced, they heard distant chanting, low, rhythmic, almost drowned out by the siren. The hair on Marcus's arms prickled. He signaled for Oliver and Hayes to remain quiet. Step by step, they followed the twisting corridors, guided by that eerie chant. Eventually, they came upon a flight of stairs leading downward, exactly the direction indicated by the camera feed for the underground chamber. The door at the bottom was propped open, presumably for the captives. They could see flickering torchlight or candlelight emanating from within. With a silent nod, Marcus readied his weapon. Hayes did the same, while Oliver hovered behind them, trembling but resolute. They descended. The chanting grew louder, the words incomprehensible. It sounded ancient, full of guttural syllables and hissing sounds that reminded Marcus of serpents. When they reached the bottom landing, they saw a narrow passage that opened into a broad underground hall. Thick stone columns supported a high ceiling, from which hung tattered banners inscribed with the cult symbol. On the floor, lines of chalk or paint formed a large triangular pattern coiled with serpent shapes. Candles and braziers lit the space, casting flickering shadows across robed figures who stood in a circle, arms raised. At least 8 of them were visible, not counting the ones who might be in the adjoining passages. The cluster of prisoners were forced to kneel near the center, trembling. A tall figure at the front wore an elaborate robe with swirling gold thread. Even at a distance, Marcus recognized the shape of the emblem around the figure's neck, a medallion identical to the design on the kitten's collar. Marcus's heart thundered. He spotted the teenage boy in the group of captives, along with 3 other adults. Their wrists and ankles were bound with zip ties, their faces contorted in terror. Another robed member moved among them, sprinkling some kind of powder from a bowl while chanting. The scene looked nightmarish. A hush fell as the chanting stopped. The figure with the golden-threaded robe stepped forward, raising a hand. "We gather at the apex of our work," the voice echoed across the chamber, resonant and cold. "Let no outsider disrupt the communion with the circle. Tonight, the final step shall be taken." Marcus scanned the area. They were outnumbered, but half the robed figures seemed unarmed, though a few carried daggers or handguns at their belts. The presence of firearms worried him most, especially in such close quarters with the hostages. If a shootout started, the prisoners could easily be hit. He motioned for Hayes to flank left around a column, while Oliver remained slightly back for cover. They crept forward, hugging the shadows, each step made precarious by the flickering light and the swirling smoke from incense braziers. The robed figure continued speaking, voice building with ritualistic fervor. "Within this circle, we hold the key to transcendence," the leader intoned. "The serum carried in your veins here," they gestured to the frightened prisoners, "represents our final puzzle piece. We honor your role in forging the new evolution." Marcus felt anger boil within him. He wanted to act to save these innocent people, but he had to pick the right moment. If they revealed themselves too soon, the cult might take the prisoners hostage at gunpoint or worse. Hayes was on the far side now, near a robed guard who stood at attention, gripping a small pistol. If Hayes could disarm that guard quietly, they'd have one less threat to worry about. The leader stepped closer to a kneeling prisoner, a middle-aged man with terror etched on his face. They raised a ceremonial dagger, the blade catching the candlelight. Let the offering commence. Marcus's stomach lurched. They were out of time. He signaled frantically to Hayes this was it. Hayes lunged from behind the column, tackling the armed guard. The guard's pistol went off, the shot reverberating through the chamber. The bullet tore into a brazier, scattering burning coals across the stone floor. Instantly, robed figures whirled, shrieking in alarm. Marcus darted forward, aiming his gun at the leader. "Police, drop your weapons, step away from the prisoners." A flurry of chaos erupted. Some cultists bolted toward side passages, robes billowing, others rushed to defend their leader. The teenage boy, momentarily distracted by the gunfire, tried to scramble away on his knees, but a robed figure grabbed him by the shoulders. Marcus shifted his aim and fired, intentionally hitting the ground near the captor's feet. The robed figure yelped and released the boy, stumbling back. Oliver emerged from behind, shouting, "Over here, get behind me," to the boy and the other captives. Two of the adult prisoners were petrified, eyes wide. The teenage boy crawled toward Oliver. But the leader in the golden-threaded robe moved with surprising agility, brandishing the dagger. In a flash, they lunged at Marcus, who sidestepped just in time to avoid being slashed. Sparks flew as the blade scraped the stone floor. A swirl of incense smoke blurred Marcus's vision for a heartbeat. Near the chamber's center, Hayes was grappling with another armed cultist. Marcus caught glimpses of robed figures scattering or launching themselves at the intruders. One of them advanced on Oliver, who stood between the prisoners and the rest of the cult. Oliver clutched his makeshift club of broken wood, terror and determination mixing in his eyes. Marcus tried to focus. The leader advanced again, slashing the dagger in swift arcs. Despite the ceremonial appearance of the weapon, it was razor-sharp. Marcus had to keep stepping back. He needed an opening to subdue this figure without gunfire. He couldn't risk shooting wildly in this chaos. A swirl of the dagger came dangerously close, grazing Marcus's arm. Pain flared, but he clenched his teeth and swung his pistol, knocking the leader's forearm aside. The dagger clattered to the floor. Marcus pinned the robed figure's arm behind their back, forcing them to their knees. He could see a shock of white hair under the hood. "Don't move," he snarled, pressing his gun to the leader's shoulder. The leader let out a hiss of breath, refusing to speak. At that moment, another cultist rushed Marcus from behind. He heard the scuffle of robes and pivoted too slowly. A hard impact slammed into his side, sending him sprawling. His gun skittered across the stone floor. The leader broke free, diving for the dagger. Marcus scrambled, cursing, trying to recover. Before the leader could reclaim the blade, Hayes roared in, tackling them to the ground. His forearm pinned their neck and he kicked the dagger away. A second cultist charged, but Hayes fired a shot. The bullet grazed the cultist's robe, enough to make them recoil and retreat. Gunfire echoed from the far side of the chamber, though Marcus couldn't see who was shooting. Thick smoke and dust hazed the air. He blinked, searching for Oliver. The archivist was on the ground, grappling with a robed figure who was attempting to drag one of the hostages away. The hostage, a young woman with tear-streaked cheeks, was screaming. Marcus ignored the sting in his arm and lunged to help. He tackled the robed figure, slamming a shoulder into their midsection. They went down in a heap, landing on spilled candle wax and burning coals. The figure howled in pain. Marcus twisted, his fists connecting with the attacker's jaw, knocking them unconscious. Oliver scrabbled backward, panting. "Thank you," he breathed, voice trembling. He turned to the wide-eyed prisoner. "Run for the stairs." The woman nodded shakily, guiding two of the other hostages who were now free of their captors. The teenage boy huddled next to Oliver, clutching at him. His face was pale, but relief flickered in his eyes to see real help had arrived. Marcus spotted more robed figures retreating through a side tunnel, apparently deciding it wasn't worth fighting armed officers. The biggest threat now was the leader, pinned by Hayes, struggling ferociously. "We have to secure them," Marcus said, rushing over. "We need the leader alive. This is our best chance to expose the entire operation." Hayes nodded, breathing hard, his nose still bleeding sluggishly. He wrestled a pair of handcuffs from his belt, locking the leader's wrists behind their back. The robed figure seethed with rage, spewing curses in a language Marcus didn't recognize. Oliver corralled the hostages to the foot of the stairs. "We have them, but I don't know if anyone else is trapped in here." Marcus glanced around the chamber. The robed figures who hadn't fled lay unconscious or wounded. Smoke from the brazier fires clung to the vaulted ceiling. The eerie triangular symbol was smeared with footprints and spattered with droplets of blood. An echoing crash from deeper in the tunnels made them all freeze, perhaps more cultists or an automatic structural lock coming down. The alarm continued to blare. Marcus's instincts told him they had to leave right now. "We'll come back with reinforcements and a full search," he said. "But for now, the priority is getting these people to safety." Hayes dragged the cult leader to their feet, ignoring the figure's thrashing. Marcus led the way up the stairs, gun in hand, scanning for stragglers. Oliver shepherded the rescued hostages, who were limping, crying, and clinging to each other. Each step felt agonizingly slow, but they finally emerged into the corridor above. The red strobe lights still pulsed, painting everything in violent flashes of crimson. In the distance, Marcus heard footfalls again. He raised his weapon, heart pounding, expecting a fresh wave of cultists, but to his surprise, the corridor was empty. "This way," Hayes shouted, motioning toward the route they'd initially come from. They hurried along, half carrying the most injured hostages. Oliver clutched the teenage boy's hand, urging him onward. When they reached the ground-level hallway leading toward the side window they'd used to enter, they saw new damage. Entire sections of the corridor walls had collapsed, or possibly heavy blast doors had sealed. The building's security system must be going haywire. The route was half blocked by a fallen beam. "Can we squeeze through?" Oliver asked, voice tight. Marcus tested the gap between the beam and the wall. "Maybe, we just have to be careful." One by one, they guided the prisoners under the beam. Hayes hauled the cult leader, still cuffed, to the opening. The robed figure twisted, nearly slipping out of his grasp. Marcus pressed the muzzle of his pistol to their side. "Don't even try it," he growled. The cult leader went still, though their glare seethed with hatred. At last, they cleared the collapsed area and found themselves near the lab they had first discovered. The door was ajar, smoke drifting from inside. Marcus's stomach clenched at the memory of the cages and the dreadful equipment. But there was no time to reflect, they needed out. The side window, pried open earlier, was still there, though now partially blocked by toppled shelves that must have been knocked over in the chaos. Marcus kicked the debris aside, then helped each person climb through. Oliver offered a steadying hand to the teenage boy. Hayes hoisted the cult leader out last, though the figure tried to resist every step of the way. They emerged into the cold night air, the sky overhead tinted a faint red by the lodge's external alarms. The wailing siren was more muted outside, but still audible. Moonlight fell on the frightened hostages, and a gust of fresh air hit them like a blessing. Marcus felt his heart hammer with relief to be out of that subterranean nightmare. The group staggered away from the building, weaving between gnarled trees. Once they were a safe distance, Marcus and Hayes paused, scanning the grounds for movement. The lodge loomed behind them, windows flickering with sporadic interior lights. No reinforcements poured out. Perhaps the remaining cultists were fleeing through hidden exits or deeper tunnels. "Let's get them to the car," Marcus said, referencing the unmarked sedan they'd arrived in. He quickly called the station from his phone, using a secure line. "Officer Riley here. We have an emergency at the Old Pine Lake Lodge. Request immediate backup, ambulances, armed units if possible. We have multiple rescued hostages and a high-value suspect in custody. Hurry." The dispatcher seemed shocked by the urgency in Marcus's voice. He gave a quick summary of the situation: a hidden cult, potential chemical or biomedical experiments, armed hostiles. The dispatcher promised to send everything they had. Moments later, Marcus helped the hostages into the sedan, though space was tight. Two of the adult captives were in rough shape, limping with bruises and possibly broken bones. Oliver slid into the back seat with them, holding the teenage boy in a reassuring grip. Hayes shoved the cult leader, still robed and handcuffed, into the passenger seat and jammed his own body beside them so they couldn't attempt escape. Marcus got behind the wheel, adrenaline still coursing, and started the engine. He flicked on the headlights, illuminating the neglected driveway. They sped away from the iron gate with its broken chain. In the rearview mirror, the lodge receded into the darkness, the red lights painting an ominous glow against the trees. For several minutes, no one spoke. The victim shivered, either from shock or the cold. The cult leader remained silent, refusing to answer any questions about additional prisoners or hidden labs. Hayes pressed a cloth to his own bloody nose, breathing through his mouth in pained gasps. Oliver finally broke the silence, his voice trembling. "We really did find them, the Circulus Serpentis, or at least something that calls itself that." Marcus nodded curtly, eyes on the winding road. "We have enough evidence now, documents, that entire underground chamber, eyewitness accounts, not to mention the hostages. They won't be able to slip away this time." The teenage boy stirred, still pale. Thank you," he managed. They took me off the street. I was walking home. They said they would." His voice choked off, tears sliding down his cheeks. Oliver reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're safe now." Marcus tightened his grip on the steering wheel. These were the lucky ones, the ones they managed to rescue. He wondered grimly how many more had suffered at the hands of this cult over the years, how many had vanished without anyone connecting the dots. When they reached the outskirts of town, a blur of flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness. Multiple squad cars, an ambulance, and a tactical van had converged at a staging area. Marcus parked, and the scene erupted with activity. Paramedics hurried to check the hostages, uniformed officers took statements, and Hayes handed over the cult leader, who continued to glower at everyone silently. Captain Ruiz, a sturdy woman with a reputation for being unflappable, arrived and immediately cornered Marcus for a debriefing. Riley, you'd better have a good explanation for why you went in alone, she said, her voice edged with tension. Marcus took a deep breath and summarized everything. The kitten, the collar, the suspicious device, the lab inside the lodge, the hostages, the confrontation, and how they'd only intended a recon before stumbling into the ritual. Throughout it all, Captain Ruiz's expression darkened. This is monstrous, she finally said, shaking her head. We'll coordinate with state police and a hazmat team. Who knows what chemicals or biological agents are inside. I need you, Hayes and Oliver, to give formal statements. And we'll need the laptop and documents you found. Marcus handed over the backpack of evidence. The adrenaline crash was hitting him, leaving him feeling drained and slightly shaky. He rubbed the cut on his arm where the dagger had grazed him, realizing he was bleeding more than he'd thought. A paramedic noticed and ushered him to an ambulance for treatment. While he sat on the edge of the ambulance, letting them disinfect and bandage the wound, he saw the teenage boy wrapped in a blanket, holding a cup of water with trembling hands. The boy glanced over, tears brimming in his eyes, and mouthed, "Thank you." Marcus mustered a faint, reassuring smile. A short while later, Hayes joined him. His nose had finally stopped bleeding, though it looked swollen and bruised. "They're sending a second wave of officers to secure the lodge," Hayes muttered. "We might have to go back in, but not until the hazmat folks clear it." Marcus nodded. "Even if they scrub the place, we have enough physical evidence and statements." His mind drifted to the kitten left at Dr. Patton's clinic. He hoped she and the kitten were safe. It was entirely possible the cult might have discovered their pet's defection, so to speak, and tried to reclaim it. As if reading his thoughts, Hayes asked, "Think they'll go after the kitten or Dr. Patton?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "We can't rule it out. We need to ensure their safety. I'll assign an officer to watch her clinic." They were interrupted by a forensic analyst who approached, looking eager and slightly frazzled. "Officer Riley, we examined that microcapsule you provided. There's more to it. We managed to extract partial data from the chip. Looks like a set of formulas referencing multiple strains of something called Serpent Protocol, possibly a drug or biological agent. Highly encrypted, but we got glimpses of references to militarized applications." A chill coursed through Marcus. So they're not just random occult fanatics. They may be trying to develop or refine a weaponized substance. The analyst nodded. "It appears that way. We'll keep digging, but it's high-level encryption." Marcus thought of the elaborate laboratory in the lodge, the frantic secrecy, the infiltration of that strange device into a helpless kitten. It all suggested that Circulus Serpentis was more than just a local cult. Maybe they were part of a global ring with ties to illicit research black market dealings. Or maybe they were an isolated cell with dangerously advanced knowledge. Either way, it was a chilling possibility. He took a moment to gather himself, then made a call to Dr. Patton. She answered on the second ring, voice tense. "Is everything all right?" "Yeah," Marcus said softly, trying not to let his exhaustion show. "We're safe. We rescued some hostages, but listen, this cult might be bigger than we suspected. I need you to stay put. I'm sending an officer to guard the clinic. Don't let anyone in you don't trust." Dr. Patton hesitated. "The kitten is stable, though still traumatized. She's asleep in a warm kennel." A pang of relief went through Marcus. He remembered the kitten's terrified eyes, how it had run straight to him as if guided by an invisible thread. In many ways, that tiny creature had unlocked this entire conspiracy, saving who knows how many lives. "Keep her safe," Marcus said. "I'll come by as soon as I can." He ended the call, feeling the heavy weight of the night's events settling onto his shoulders. Captain Ruiz approached again, arms folded. "We've set up a perimeter around the lodge. Some of those robed psychos have tried to slip out through hidden exits. We've apprehended a few, and there may be more inside. We need to comb the entire property." Marcus nodded. "I'll help once my arm is bandaged." Ruiz glanced at the blood soaking the gauze. "You're going to the hospital first, no argument. Hayes, you two need to be checked properly. I won't have you keeling over in the middle of a raid." Hayes shot Marcus a rueful smirk. "Orders are orders." They parted ways with Oliver, who was giving a statement to a pair of detectives. Marcus and Hayes climbed into a waiting ambulance for the short ride to the local hospital. The paramedics fussed over them, verifying vital signs and ensuring no major internal injuries. At the hospital, it was a blur of nurses, disinfectants, and bright overhead lights. Marcus found himself staring at the ceiling tiles, replaying the entire ordeal in his head. He could still smell the incense, hear the chanting. He thought again of the battered kitten with that ominous collar, the device embedded under its skin. Somehow, that small creature had broken open a decades-long mystery. By the time a doctor stitched the cut on Marcus's arm, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with dawn. Exhaustion draped over him like a lead blanket, but he forced himself to remain alert. Once he and Hayes were declared stable and cleared to leave, they met up with Oliver, who had just arrived at the hospital in a patrol car for a precautionary check. The archivist looked rattled but physically okay. They reconvened in the hospital cafeteria, which was deserted at this early hour. A stale pot of coffee sat on a burner. Marcus poured himself a cup, barely noticing the taste. Oliver joined him, hugging a paper cup in his hands for warmth. Hayes sat heavily on a plastic chair, pressing an ice pack to his swollen nose. For a moment, none of them spoke. The bright fluorescent lights seemed too normal, too mundane after the horrors of the lodge. Finally, Oliver broke the silence. I can't believe how big this was, how deep it goes. Those documents alone, we might be looking at a massive conspiracy. Marcus sipped the coffee, wincing at the bitterness. At least we have evidence now, enough to blow the lid off them. The state police, the FBI, or even higher agencies might get involved. If that Serpent Protocol data is as serious as it sounds, we're dealing with a potential terror threat, not just a small cult. Hayes nodded. They've probably been operating in the shadows for decades, refining their methods, waiting for the right moment to test or sell whatever they're creating. We still don't know if it's a virus, a neurotoxin, or something else. Oliver stared into his coffee. One question still nags me: why the kitten? If they wanted to smuggle data, there might be easier ways. Why risk it on a living creature that could run away exactly as it did? Marcus had asked himself the same question. Maybe they were testing an implantation technique or seeing if their device would function in an animal host for extended periods. Or maybe some faction within the group wanted to sabotage them, leaving clues for the authorities. Hayes frowned, a splinter faction inside the cult. Marcus shrugged, feeling the weight of conjecture. We can't rule it out. Someone might have orchestrated the kitten's escape, ensuring it found a cop. It's too coincidental otherwise. Oliver's eyes lit with a thought. Then that means not all of them are fanatically loyal. Some might be defectors or blackmailed participants. That could help us get more information if we question the right people. Marcus agreed. We'll see what the leader says once they're formally interrogated, though I'm not optimistic. They strike me as fanatical. A uniformed officer approached, clearing his throat. Sirs, Captain Ruiz wants you to know the perimeter at the lodge is secure. They've uncovered a sub-basement network of tunnels, some apparently collapsed. They're still finding caged animals and remnants of labs. Several more cult members have been taken into custody. She's requested that you come back once you're feeling up to it to help identify areas you explored. Marcus set his coffee down. Thanks, we'll head back soon. With that, they stood, adrenaline reawakening under the exhaustion. There was still a long day ahead, reports, more questioning, a thorough sweep of that nightmare lodge. But at least now they had the resources of the full department and potentially higher agencies. On the way out, Marcus paused to call Dr. Patton again. She picked up, sounding relieved to hear from him. The officer arrived. Everything is quiet for now. The kitten's still resting. If it helps, I scanned it again. No other devices. She's skittish, but I think she trusts me. Marcus felt a swell of gratitude. Good, keep me posted, and if anything suspicious happens, call. They left the hospital, picking up a spare police cruiser at the station. The entire precinct buzzed like a disturbed hornet's nest. Desks were piled with new reports, phones rang incessantly, and multiple briefing rooms were occupied by detectives, state police investigators, and even representatives from a federal task force who had rushed in after hearing rumors of a possible chemical terror threat. Captain Ruiz waved them over. Her face was drawn with fatigue, but she was clearly in command. There you are. We've got a partial tally of the rescued animals, at least a dozen, mostly cats and dogs, a few exotic creatures. They're being transported to safe facilities. The hostages you rescued are giving statements. They're traumatized but stable. Marcus nodded, feeling a weight lift from him. Any sign of the tall intruder we encountered? Ruiz shook her head. Not yet. We've apprehended about 14 individuals total, including the robed leader you brought in. The rest scattered. We'll probably be chasing them down for weeks. But with the evidence you found, they won't be able to hide easily. Hayes cleared his throat, and the data from that microcapsule, forensics said they found references to a potential weapon. Ruiz grimaced. They're still analyzing. The encryption is complex and it'll take time to decode everything. But preliminary results indicate some sort of genetically engineered toxin, possibly lethal. The FBI wants it contained ASAP. Oliver rubbed his temples. When I think about how close we came to walking away from all this, if that kitten hadn't come to Marcus, we might never have known. Ruiz turned to Marcus, a flicker of a smile softening her stern features. Good instincts, Riley, following up on a random stray. We owe that little cat a big debt. Marcus felt a wave of emotion. The memory of how the kitten's eyes pleaded for help was burned into his mind. I'd like to adopt it, he murmured. The words surprised him as much as anyone. Assuming no one else claims her, she's been through enough, might as well have a stable home. Ruiz nodded. We can arrange that. For now, she'll stay under protective watch at Dr. Patton. Once the dust settles, she's all yours. Marcus smiled, exhaustion tugging at the corners of his eyes, but relief warming his chest. Over the next several days, the investigation reached fever pitch. Marcus, Hayes, and Oliver found themselves working nonstop, aiding in the search of the lodge, cataloging evidence, and giving statements to various agencies. The place turned out to be a labyrinth of hidden passages, sealed rooms, and partial archives. They found more cages, some containing animals so starved and traumatized it broke the officers' hearts to see. They also discovered cryptic references to expansions of the Circulus Serpentis in other counties and possibly other states, hidden bank accounts, code words for shipments, and a list of selected sites. It was the tip of a massive iceberg. Federal authorities stepped in with bigger resources to track leads across the region. As for the captured cult leader, whose name turned out to be Elinor Voss, she refused to cooperate, spouting only cryptic dogma about the Circle's eternal mandate and the new Serpent Dawn. Others apprehended at the site were more talkative, though many claimed ignorance of the deeper plans, insisting they'd been drawn in by promises of secret knowledge or personal power. Some professed they had no idea about the extreme experiments. Marcus doubted all of them, but it was up to the courts to decide who was telling the truth. In the midst of all this, Marcus checked in on the kitten every chance he got. Dr. Patton noted that the little feline began to recover once the bullet fragments of the night's chaos settled and the staff could properly clean and feed her. At first, she remained skittish, but Dr. Patton's gentle care slowly coaxed her out of her shell. By the time Marcus visited a week later, the kitten actually recognized his voice and let him hold her without trembling. She was a small tuxedo cat with black and white patches, and her big eyes seemed to carry a world of secrets. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Marcus murmured, stroking the kitten's soft fur. She pressed her head against his hand, purring faintly. Her old collar, the one bearing the cult symbol, had been taken into evidence. She now wore a plain red collar which Dr. Patton had given her. Dr. Patton stood nearby, smiling. "She's a survivor. With the right home, she'll do just fine." Marcus nodded. "I'm looking forward to taking her home." A few days after that, once the formal adoption paperwork cleared and the kitten was declared healthy, Marcus brought her to his apartment. He set out a cozy bed in the living room along with toys, scratching posts, and plenty of food. The kitten took a few hours to acclimate, weaving around the furniture, sniffing corners, occasionally mewing with curiosity. Eventually, she settled on Marcus's couch, curling into a small ball. Marcus sank into a chair, letting out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for weeks. His arm still ached from the stitches, though they were healing. His mind still buzzed with the scope of the ongoing investigation. But at least for now, in the quiet warmth of his apartment, he could find a moment's peace. He gazed at the kitten, recalling that first moment she sprinted to him on that suburban street. That single instance of trust, an injured, terrified animal seeking help, had led to unraveling a dangerous conspiracy. While he felt relief that so many innocents were saved, he also knew the fight wasn't over. Circulus Serpentis might have other enclaves, other labs. The road ahead promised more revelations. But for this night, he focused on the gentle sound of the kitten's purr, letting it remind him that even in the darkest places, a small spark of hope could shine through. In the following weeks, the story broke publicly, sending shockwaves through the local community and beyond. Headlines read, "Secret Cult Busted at Pine Lake Lodge Officer, Kitten Spur Investigation." The sensational angle of a frightened kitten leading to the downfall of a hidden cult captured public imagination. Reporters clamored for interviews. The police department held press conferences, though they withheld many details about the group's rituals and the specific nature of the chemical research. They didn't want to spark panic or tip off any remaining cult cells. For Marcus, life became a whirlwind of depositions, testimony, and late-night strategy meetings. The rescued hostages were placed under protective services, receiving trauma counseling. Some of them had families who were overjoyed at their return, others had nowhere to go. The teenage boy was reunited tearfully with his parents, who had thought him a runaway. That reunion was one bright spot in an otherwise grim narrative. Eventually, the day of the arraignment hearing came for Elinor Voss, the so-called leader. Marcus attended, wearing his dress uniform along with Hayes and Oliver. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers and journalists. Voss entered in a beige jumpsuit, her once imposing demeanor diminished by shackles and the presence of guards, yet her eyes still burned with an unsettling fervor, scanning the faces in the courtroom. The prosecutor read a litany of charges: kidnapping, false imprisonment, animal cruelty, illegal experimentation, conspiracy to commit terrorism. Voss remained silent, refusing to enter a plea beyond a soft, repetitive chant of "the circle endures." The judge ordered her remanded without bail, citing her threat to public safety and potential flight risk. Marcus sat in the gallery, watching the proceedings with a mix of relief and unease. He doubted Voss would roll over and reveal everything she knew. The real question was whether the authorities could locate all the hidden labs, the cult's funding sources, and their remaining members. Even so, this was a major blow to Circulus Serpentis. After the hearing, while reporters swarmed the courtroom's exit, Marcus slipped away. He found Oliver leaning against a marble pillar in the hallway, looking pensive. "What's on your mind?" Marcus asked. Oliver rubbed his temple. "It's just, we may have cut off the head of the snake, so to speak, but that group had ties going back decades. I keep thinking about those old case files from the 1980s about rumored sacrifices missing people never found. We've only uncovered one branch of it. Marcus nodded gravely. Agreed, but we can't ignore that we've saved lives. We exposed a major cell, and hopefully the rest will fall once we track their connections. Oliver mustered a small smile. You're right, I guess I'm still processing everything. Hard to believe a random little kitten was the key. Marcus glanced at a TV mounted in the hallway showing a local news broadcast about the case. The anchor was talking about the kitten in glowing terms, dubbing her the hero cat. Marcus felt a warm rush of pride. It's like she knew, Oliver added softly. I don't believe in fate, but it's almost like that cat was guided to the right person at the right time. Marcus shrugged, though part of him couldn't help but wonder the same thing. Well, she's safe now, and I'm grateful. A few days later, Marcus returned to normal patrol shifts, though normal felt forever changed by the events at Pine Lake Lodge. He kept the kitten at home during his work hours, checking in with a neighbor who agreed to cat sit. In the evenings, he'd come home and find the kitten waiting by the door, purring and greeting. He'd scoop her up, feeling an odd sense of comfort as her small body vibrated against his chest. One evening, as he dozed on the couch with the TV murmuring softly, the kitten hopped onto his chest, nuzzling under his chin. Marcus opened his eyes, smiling. In that moment, he realized he'd never given her a proper name. He'd been so consumed with the case, the adoption process, and the swirl of events. Stroking her soft fur, he murmured, You need a name, something strong for a cat who brought down a cult. He thought of mythological figures, Athena, Artemis, Bastet from various ancient lore. But then the memory of the swirling serpent symbol flashed in his mind, and he chuckled wryly. How about Sage, he mused. The cat blinked, tilting her head. Sage it is, Marcus decided. It felt right, a reference to wisdom, to unraveling secrets. The kitten mewed in what he chose to interpret as approval. A text pinged on his phone. It was Hayes checking in. Heard you name the cat yet? Marcus typed back Sage. The response came quickly, fitting, great name. Marcus set the phone aside, letting Sage cuddle in his lap. Outside, night had fallen. The city lights glimmered in the distance. For a brief instant, he let himself savor the ordinary tranquility of a quiet evening at home, something that felt hard-earned after the horrors they'd uncovered. Yet he knew the ripples of this case would reverberate for a long time. Circulus Serpentis wasn't finished, even if its local cell had been dismantled. He and the department would be watching for signs, murky lades, coded communications, references to the serpent symbol. Part of him dreaded the day they might have to face an even larger threat. But for now, Sage's gentle purring reminded him that not every mystery ended in darkness. Sometimes, a spark of hope found its way into the world, like a frightened kitten running to an officer in a quiet suburban street, changing everything. And that was enough for tonight.